Good evening, everyone. My name is Zach Kyes, and I'm the art director of the Architectural Association and the AA Print Studio. And I'm delighted to welcome tonight our guests Joseph Grigely and Ulrich Obrist. Before I introduce them, please remember to switch off your mobile phones so we don't interrupt tonight's lecture. Joseph Grigely's lecture, Exhibition, Prosthetics, and Exchange with curator Ulrich Obrist, is the first in the Excursus lecture and publication series initiated by Bedford Press. With this Excursus series, we aim to invite practitioners from within and beyond the culture of architecture whose practices engage and rethink the form and activity of publishing. The first publication of this series, based on tonight's event, will be published later this year. The history of the AA as a machine for the production and dissemination of publications is long and has many footnotes. In more recent history, the school established the AA Print Studio in 1971 in an attempt to organically shape the school's architectural discourse through the publication of productions, the production of publications. This legacy of publications as a primary medium, conceived as a site for debate and exchange rather than simply a form of documentation, is the impetus for initiating tonight's event and one of the reasons that led us to establish Bedford Press, which is a small-scale printing press located in the closet at the AA. It's a privilege to start this ongoing project with the work of Joseph Grigely. To be very honest, I only recently discovered Joseph's work, and many of you may be much more familiar about his art practice than I. Personally, as part of a younger generation, and as a graphic designer as well, whose sort of raw material is language, I felt an urgency to show Joseph's work here at the AA. My encounter with Joseph's work was not through a gallery or an exhibition, but rather within the pages of some of the amazing publications and printed matter that he very generously sent me after we met at MoMA in New York. Since 1994, Grigely, who became deaf at a very young age, has incorporated the scribblings of the hearing into his installations. This practice takes as its central concerns voice, speech, hearing, and listening. In conversation earlier, Joseph mentioned something which particularly resonated with my own interests, which was the idea of using publications to take the work somewhere the exhibition can't go, to inflect it, to comment on it, or to counterpoint it. This questioning of the extent to which publications and their representations are actually a part of the work, rather than merely a documentation, are particularly important to consider as design discourse is increasingly articulated through an ever-expanding sea of books and magazines. Grigely, born in Massachusetts, currently lives and works in Chicago. He directs a graduate program in visual and critical studies at the Art Institute of Chicago. His solo shows include most recently St. Cecilia at the Baltimore Contemporary Museum, as well as others such as White Noise at the Whitney, publications and publication projects at Cranbrook Museum of Art, Barbican Conversations at the Barbican Center, and Migrateurs at Musée d'Art Moderne, curated by Ulrich Obrist. My understanding is that tonight Joseph will show as well some of the catalogues from Ulrich's archive. And in the words of Ingo Nehrmann, Ulrich Obrist is one of the most eccentric producers of meaning in the art world. A non-stop interviewer, his curatorial jumpstart began with a show in his kitchen. Ulrich Obrist joined the Serpentine Gallery as co-director of exhibitions and programs and director of international projects in April 2006. He has curated over 200 international exhibitions since 1991 and produced over 80 books, including Interviews Volume 1 and soon Interviews Volume 2. Exhibitions include Do It, Take Me, I'm Yours, Cities on the Move, Uncertain States of America, and Il Tempo del Postino, which he co-curated with Philip Pereno, and Indian Highway, which is currently on view, I think in its last week at the Serpentine Gallery. So it is my pleasure to introduce both of them tonight.
Can everyone hear me all right? Can you hear me in the back? Okay, good. I want to thank Zach and the Architectural Association for the opportunity to be here with you today. And I'd also like to thank Ulrich for joining us. We've known each other and worked together on projects for almost 15 years now. Art is a relationship that is ever evolving. My talk today has two perspectives. One is the perspective of Joseph Grigely, the artist. That's the person Zach introduced you to. He's a person who mostly works with conversations and conversational exchanges. The other perspective is more academic. It's a perspective of textual criticism and bibliography, which I studied at Oxford in the early 1980s. Textual criticism and bibliography are disciplinary practices that explore how texts are disseminated in culture. The discipline especially tries to define the parameters of what constitutes textual boundaries. Where does a poem begin and end? And by extension, where does an artwork begin and end? Where do exhibitions begin and end? These were questions that I discussed in a book which I wrote called Textuality, or Theory in Textual Criticism. My discussion today will focus on one aspect of that research, what I call exhibition prosthetics. I've been using the term exhibition prosthetics for about 10 years now to describe an array of exhibition conventions. These conventions include labels, titles, checklists, exhibition announcements, press releases, catalogues, and to some extent even flowers. Flowers are often the first thing you see when you enter some of the world's great museums. The Met, for example, or the Art Institute of Chicago. But do we notice them? In what ways do flowers and press releases and checklists affect the different ways that we read an exhibition? Perhaps out of habit, we are decidedly inured to the experience of these conventions. They are part of the machinery of exhibiting. We read titles, labels, catalogues, because their authority establishes for the artwork a sense of place. In this respect, moving closer to the artwork involves moving further away from the artwork, to look closer at the fringes and margins of representation. And that's what seems to me a very fundamental question. To what extent are these various exhibition conventions actually part of the art, and not merely an extension of it? I want to start with an example of a human prosthesis, an arm. A prosthesis is essentially an attachment. The first modern usage of prosthesis as a medical term dates to 1706. It is described as that which fills up what it's wanting. That is, prosthesis remediates. It fills, it extends, it supplements. But it does not do this without also becoming a part of, not apart from, the body that it fills, extends, and supplements. As the literary critic David Welch has written, the prosthesis is essentially about belonging. In theory, this kind of seamlessness is ideal, but it's much harder to accomplish in practice. Consider as an example this wheelchair lift on a building near my home in Chicago. The building is a mixed-use building, part business, part residence. On the left is the front of the building, and on the right, in a car park abutting the building, is the wheelchair lift. As you can see, it is a retrofitted lift. But what's important here is that a prosthesis like this, as an attachment, draws attention to that point of attachment. It is awkward, never quite so belonging as we would like it to be. If buildings are bodies, and I think they are, so too with our social topography. This is a roadside sign from Lake Placid in upstate New York. Like a caption, a sign like this makes evident through language that which is otherwise not present. This is usual for the prosthesis to simultaneously stand and stand in for what is absent. It could be said that by definition, the prosthesis aspires for seamlessness, aspires to incorporate itself into a whole so that it is indivisible from the whole. Human prostheses are today incredibly elaborate. They work both as visual and functional surrogates to the original. They weren't always like this, though. In the past, the role was primarily visual, to incorporate the body's corporality. About 30 years ago, I had a deaf classmate named Roger. Roger had only one arm, his right arm. And we were attending the sign language class together. And the first day of the class, the teacher comes in and she signs to everyone, "Good morning." And we all signed back, "Good morning," except for Roger, who signed, "Good morning." And it's the first day of class, and the teacher's trying to be very emphatic about what you could call phonological and morphological precision. So she says, "Okay, now, if I use two hands, I want you to use two hands." So she signs, "Good morning," again. And the class signs back, "Good morning," except for Roger, which really decided on pleasing people and doing what he's told to do. So with his right hand, he pulled off the prosthesis and signed, "Good morning." Now, all three of these examples, the wheelchair lift, the deaf child signing Roger, involve disability because the prosthesis is historically and etymologically discussed as an extension of the human body. The body is both a reality and a metaphor for other bodies. Books are bodies, exhibitions are bodies, buildings are bodies. What is it that makes a body complete? What makes a body of an exhibition whole? In Miko Bell's book, Double Exposures, she explains that the discourse around which museums exist and which defines their primary function is exposition. Exposition involves the doubling of both showing and telling, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm showing and telling about the practice of showing and telling. Historically, one role of museums involves authenticating, to vouch for the historical truth of the objects being displayed. This is where much of the telling comes into play. One of my favorite installations is this small vitrine that can be found at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. The installation is titled Edison's Last Breath. Not Edison's Last Breath, Stop, but Edison's Last Breath, question mark. Here, the truth about history is uncertainty itself. And so it would seem that the relationship between the body and the prosthesis is a dialogic relationship, each informing the other, each supplementing the other. The French critic Gerard Chenet had spoken of verbal appendages such as titles and captions as paratext, that which is alongside the main text. But alongside, it's not enough. There is a movement between the body and its extensions, a movement that is peritextual in design, a movement that involves the peregrinations of a shifting ground. What I find particularly engaging about Edison's last breath is how the label is contained within the vitrine, neatly positioned beside the test tube, containing Edison's maybe last breath. Like Piero Manzoni's famous cans of Chet, it's not the contents of the test tube or the cans that matter, it's much as how they are labeled, and we construct meaning on the basis of our beliefs about those labels. This in turn makes a museum like Sir John Soane's museum so compelling. Soane's museum has no labels on the walls, which is precisely as Soane intended. Instead of labels, Soane prepared 3 guidebooks for the museum. One prepared in 1830, then 1832, and 1835. In each successive guidebook, which modulated the movement of visitors through the museum, always took the visitors on a different path. This modus operandi continued in the exhibition, which Hans Ulrich curated at Soane's museum in 1999. The exhibition consisted of a number of contemporary artists, among them Sarah Thwin Evans, Steve McQueen, and Douglas Gordon. Rather than labeling the art, Sarah designed a fold-out brochure that operated like Soane's guidebooks as a supplement to the exhibition that was also a part of the exhibition. Among archivists, checklists and similar printed materials are often described as ephemera. Ephemera consist of the incarnation of the ephemeral. It is a sort of unexceptional, everyday stuff that typically gets thrown away. Exhibition announcements and press releases and checklists rarely get saved. And at times, I wonder why. These various conventions have a profound influence in how we read art, how we work our way to it and through it. Sometimes I think that artists realize this better than critics and historians do. Starting in 1990, a body of work has developed around the prosthetics. For a show at the Louisiana Museum in Denmark, Neil Cummings and Marysia Lewandowska composed and published an errata to the exhibition catalog that explores the relationship between everyday objects and art objects. During the same time, Felix Gonzalez Torres created his singular and well-known poster projects. It was at this time that Hans Ulrich started organizing projects that redefined the parameters of plates by taking the exhibition outside the gallery and the museum. His first exhibition, entitled The Kitchen Show, took place in 1991 in the kitchen of its apartment in St. Gallen. In the catalog, Hans Ulrich explained, quote, "The starting point is the idea to present an exhibition in an unspectacular place," unquote. As its curatorial overgrew, so too did the definition of what constituted an unspectacular place. In projects he did with the Museum in Progress in Vienna, he turned the Austrian daily newspaper Der Standard into a museum with a series of interventions. Artists were invited to create projects that were published as part of the regular editorial content of the newspaper. With Alcerio Boetti, he curated a project of Boetti's paintings of airplanes that appeared in the In-Flight magazine of Austrian Airlines. And the images were also made into jigsaw puzzles for children. I have to admit this is one of my favorite projects, in part because one thing I like to do when I'm looking at art, it's a bit of detour from what I want to say, but it occurred to me how displacement between different contexts provides a frame for how we read the work. How many artists produce work that can survive a transition between, say, the Tate Modern and the children's bedroom? And some artists do this very well. Thomas Schutt, for example. Boetti does it. A related publication project with the publication at the museum, it's Hans Ulrich's project, Point Irony. Point Irony, it's a hybrid poster exhibition that he began in 1997. Each publication and artist is given a free rein to produce, design the project, and 100,000 copies are printed and distributed. But what's important is where they're distributed, not just museums and galleries, but cafes, schools, cinemas. Projects like Point Irony work in a way that realigns the conventions by which art is disseminated. Such realignment was the modus operandi of a series of exhibitions that took place at the Museum of Modern Art of the city of Paris. Artists were invited to use a variety of public locations within the museum, the bookshop and the cafe among them. And each exhibition was accompanied by a low-cost catalog that, rather than reiterating or quoting the exhibition, functioned to inflect the exhibition. It was with Hans Ulrich's Nano Museum that the Migratory Museum became pocket-sized. The Nano Museum was precisely 66 millimeters by 97 millimeters and hosted more than a dozen exhibitions before, and this is a rumor, before Douglas Gordon lost it in a bar. Now, you heard me right. Douglas lost the museum in a bar. It is perhaps the first museum ever to be displaced in such a way. Now, it's important to put all of this production into the context of the early 1990s. The stock market crash of 1987 ended the megalomania of the 1980s and redirected aesthetic practices towards something much more modest in scale. At the same time, artists working in a way that could be described as institutional critique emerged. Andrea Fraser, for example, who turned the gallery docent into a reflexively critical performance. In a similar way that Hans Ulrich made exhibitions happen in the space of a newspaper or magazine, Fraser likewise used a conventional institutional prosthesis, the gallery tour, as an exhibition space. Hans Ulrich's contribution was to remake curatorial practice as a form of institutional criticism. At this point, I'm going to make a turn in my discussion. I want to talk about some art I've made that affects the idea of the exhibition space, the exhibition prosthesis, and how it fits into some of the paradigms I've outlined. There are two basic examples I will talk about. The first involves what I call unmaking the prosthesis, and the second involves engaging the prosthesis. The first involves, as I stated, the removal of an existing prosthesis. That is, instead of operating in a way where more information is provided by way of labels, titles, and captions, the work divests itself of this information. And it's a process of making that involves unmaking. For 15 years, my work has explored the disjunction between visual experience and auditory experience. This body of work is inflected by my deafness. I should explain that I am totally deaf and have been this way since I was 10 years old. It's not the deafness, however, that's important, but the implications of it and the way it realigns the sensory world. What does the world look like with the sound turned off? How might it be that language can be said to caption human experience? Painters like Hogarth and Gainsborough and Canaletto frequently painted people engaged in some kind of conversational discourse. But the inhabitants of those paintings, for all that they say nothing at all. A recent project involving photographs of people singing in the New York Times is called Songs Without Words. I've removed the captions because they seem somehow reductive. It was Susan Sontag who told us that every photograph wants a caption. While the caption labels an image, it also imprisons the image. There's another way of removing captions from everyday life. All you have to do is turn off the sound on your television. Watch the news without sound. Watch a concert without sound. Watch a sitcom without sound. At first it will look contrived and awkward. And after a while the contrivance and awkwardness start to get interesting. Because these things remind us of just how ambiguous the body is when it doesn't have words to sustain it. This ambiguity is semantically liberating. The photographs of people singing in the Times also have this way of reminding us that visual representations are not just about the visual field, they're also about the auditory field. Many of my conversations with hearing people are inscribed on paper. And it's by using papers like the two illustrated here that I typically construct my wall pieces and installations. This has been an ongoing subject of my work for the past 15 years. This piece is a recent work titled "We're Bantering, Drunkening About What's Important in Life." I know it's not a publication, but this piece in particular has a bearing on where my publications come from. This relationship is based on how they are composed, how and why I select certain papers and the kind of relationships that come out of them. As Joseph Albert said about color relations, you cannot put one color beside another color without changing both. This is also true for verbal narratives. You cannot put one word beside another word without also changing both. This is how relational grammar operates. and how relational practices involve not just the semantics of language, but formal relations more generally. During the 1990s, I did several projects in which publication served as an exhibition. Some of these I did with Hans Ulrich, such as Point Irony. One project I did here in London was called Barbican Conversations. Zach mentioned that project in its introduction. The basis of the project was to utilize the Barbican Center as both a source of conversational discourse and also as a place of dissemination. If you've been to the Barbican before, you know just how complex it is as a center for the arts. There's a cinema, 2 performing art stages, there's a theater, concerts there, numerous birds also. The birds are important. Like coffee breaks, birds function to enable critical conversational discourse that alternates between being relevant and irrelevant, between being reverent and irreverent. Because there is so much public programming at the Barbican, there is throughout the center printed information about the programming in the form of brochures, broadsheets, handbills. The exhibition consisted primarily of redistributing the conversations collected in birds as a form of information brochure. These brochures were mingled with information brochures in the center, so people did not go to the exhibition. More often, they simply stumbled on the exhibition. We printed 3 separate brochures. One of them was a simple 2-page brochure, but several, 2 were what we call a roll fold. When one page is open, then the next page is open, and the next, each time it turns, a new set of relations is created. So what's on the back, it's on the front, and turning. Very important concept in folding design that has always impressed me. Another one combined both roll fold and accordion fold. Starts off rolled, and then it rolls, and then to show, whoops, sorry here. Then to show this story, which appears on 2 pages, starts one relationship, another relationship, then the accordion's open. It seems superficial, but it's not, because one of the fundamental challenges in any kind of visual practice is narrative direction. How do you move someone through an exhibition? Books, for the most part, are easy. You turn the page, the narrative direction, it's already built in it. How can you create a more discursive narrative? Over the years, there have been many other publication projects, the goal of these being to take people to the art rather than make people go to the art. This kind of thinking is quite antithetical to American curatorial and exhibition practices. We're going to the museum, it's like going to church. A project like Barbican Conversations could not have been done in America. The few times I've done publication projects for American museums, the experience was always tempered by various administrative challenges in the process of realizing the publication. One exception was a project at the Parrish Museum of Art in Southampton, New York, curated by Ingrid Schaffner and Melissa Friedman. This exhibition involved inviting artists to interact with the museum and its archives. And among the archives were several cyanotypes that were made at the turn of the century by Alice Chase, the wife of the painter William Merritt Chase. Many of her images showed small groups of people whose relationships were hard to pin down, which is a perfect captionless quotation from everyday life. My project simply involved enlarging one of the cyanotypes from 3 by 5 inches to 23 by 33 inches, and these were displayed and distributed through the museum's gift shop, not in the exhibition space of the museum. Another prosthetic convention I find engaging is the exhibition announcement. I don't have the time to talk today about this as extensively as I'd like, but I will mention one project I did for the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford. The basic idea here was to do a postcard-sized image of a well-known painting by the Hudson River School painter John Kensett. The image showed people talking on the shoreline, gesturing at a large breaking wave. The auditory fields of both nature and human commentary on that nature. And the verso, I printed a conversation I had with a friend in New York, something a little bit disjunctive in relation to the image. What's interesting is this. After the cards were mailed out, several of them were returned to the museum, and they had notes attached to them, all saying in different ways. There were some notes on the card. Maybe somebody lost it or forgot it and didn't want to send it out. Maybe it was sent out by accident. The idea of a card like this is not to represent the art, but simply to present it. Announcement cards like catalogues and posters have this possible way of taking an exhibition places the exhibition itself does not go. My favorite publication project was produced for the Berlin Biennial in 2001. Instead of creating work within an exhibition space, my goal was to disperse the work throughout the city of Berlin. To do this, I printed 4 conversation papers, replicating not just the conversation, but also the same color and texture paper as the original. And the same conversation that might be on both sides. These papers were then placed in unincidental locations, sometimes 1 or 2, sometimes 2 or 3. They were left on counters in bars, at tables in restaurants, or dropped in the street, placed on seats of buses. This was perhaps the most unincidental exhibition project I've ever done. So unincidental, I'm not sure the curators even noticed it. They never even commented on it. My conclusion now is brief. The narratives of exhibitions are inherently discursive. They are not like the narratives of books where we move from word to word and line to line and page to page. In the space of the museum or the gallery, our movements are more unpredictable. From one painting to another, one room to another. Our path, of course, is usually determined not by conventions, but by peregrinations. An exhibition is unstable by definition. Unstable, incomplete, uncontained, and uncontainable. Like film trailers that offer clips and previews of upcoming films, contemporary exhibitions involve the fragmentation of an entity and its dispersion into a variety of representations. Earth is an age of fragmented narratives, a culture of bits and pieces that in themselves become, like the ruins and fragments of Sir John Soane's museum, a synecdoche for the whole. As our global economy implodes and exhibition practices reinvent themselves to take into account radical shifts in our aesthetic economy, we can assure ourselves that we have not seen the end of this fragmentation. it's ours to work with and ours to create from. Okay, thank you. That's the end of this. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joseph. That was a very wonderful showing and telling about the act of showing and telling. So now we can open it up to a conversation, and then for about 15 minutes, and then we can have some questions as well from the audience.
So first of all, many thanks to Joseph and many thanks to Zach. And in these infinite conversations with Joseph, actually one of the things we've never spoken about that I thought could be interesting to speak tonight is about epiphany. And in an interview I read the other day, Joseph, which you gave, you talk about this epiphany that actually you somehow had always these notes and for more than 20 years, and all of a sudden, I mean, you've always been throwing them away. And then there was this day in the early 90s, you said, where you had dinner with a friend, and afterwards there was scraps of papers all over the table with fragments of the conversation. And obviously something happened that night. So I was curious if you could tell us about this epiphany in the very early 90s.
It was a bizarre experience. Not really the kind of eureka moment that some people make it to be. What happened was, up to a certain point in the late 80s, I was making art that looked like art, felt like art, smelled like art, tasted like art. I wanted to do something a little different, but I didn't know what it was and where it was, and I've been having these conversations with people where I asked them to write down what they were saying. Up to that point, I tried to lip read people, and it didn't really work. I mean, lip reading is really hard when you're totally deaf, and so many words look alike on the lips. I mean, when you say bathroom, it looks like you're saying, fuck you. I had a lot of misunderstandings. So I asked people to write. One night I had this long dinner with a friend, and there were papers, like Ulrich said, all over the plates, table, floor, chairs. I gathered them up, put them in the pile. A week later, I put them on the floor of the studio. I didn't know what I was looking at. I learned from them. And what I saw on the paper, some went off the page, writing on top of writing, drawings. I realized this isn't writing, this is talking on paper. There's a difference between writing and talking on paper. So it became a matter of saving the papers, learning from them, and it took me a few years before I finally tried to move them into something that could be called art. The first several curators I showed the work to said, what is this stuff? And it took a while before some people got interested in them. First curator to respond to it was Bill Erning at White Columns, 1993.
So that was maybe 2 or 3 years before we met. So first kind of exhibitions of what already then was a kind of a growing archive of thousands and thousands of pieces of paper. Since then, your archive has obviously grown immensely. And I was very curious if you can tell us a little bit about the state of archives now, because you've also done, I mean, pieces, gigantic pieces. I remember the Paris, when we showed in Paris, your chapel. It was a room at the Musée d'Art Moderne. It was almost like a Rothko chapel made out of thousands and thousands and thousands of little papers. And that was like almost 10 years ago. So since then, there is even more. So can you tell us a little bit how the archive is archived? And I mean, there is obviously white noise, two versions of white noise. There is conversations with the hearing. There are these kind of very, very big pieces. There are the different ways how you categorize it. It's actually very interesting. When we saw the piece before with the colors, it reminded me of 19th century novelist Adalbert Stifter, who always said, because he had, in a similar way to you having all these papers, he had all these books, and he said rather than classifying, there's always a problem also, what do we do with books? And he was basically saying we could classify our books according to colors. So Adalbert Stifter had all his red books and all his blue books and all his green books. So but that's obviously only one possibility of bringing order. I mean, Alighiero Boetti was always saying we sort of choose one category of order in an archive and then it creates disorder. So I'm curious if you could tell us, it's many questions in one. They're kind of a complex of question, but that's maybe appropriate because the archive is a very complex matter of affair. So somehow, how is your archive structured? How many archives are there within the archives? And what kind of categories are there of order and disorder?
That's it, archives within the archives. There are lots of different ways they get classified, categorized, labeled. Color is one of them. It was a period of time around 1999-2000 where I was dealing with what I called monochromes. Where we might have 10 or 15 papers, all of one color, but different shades, different tones, dealing with formal relations. We don't have one here, but built like this. But a lot of that goes back to Albert's and its homage to the square. So there's a certain set of formal relations that I'm trying to develop in something like that. Sometimes the archive is based on individual people. There have been a couple of people with whom I've had extensive conversations. I did one show that was based on that here in London several years ago. It was called Lost in Jersey City. For a period of time, I had a studio in Jersey City, New Jersey. And Alan Cantor had a studio in Jersey City, too. We used to spend a lot of time with each other. The place called the Flamenco. The Flamenco wasn't what you think it is. It was a 24-hour diner. And we'd go there for 80 hours, sit down at the diner booth and talked about everything imaginable, including cats to curators, not necessarily in that direction. When I did the show with Alan, all the conversations I showed there were with one person, that one person. Although it wasn't labeled as such. Sometimes they're labeled by date, sometimes by place, sometimes by kind of paper. Sometimes I label them according to whether they have some kind of drawing that's part of it, or maybe an arrow. So there are a lot of different ways for organizing the archive, and it's constantly evolving. Right now it's about maybe 65,000 sheets of paper. But to do something like this takes me about 3 or 4 months to do, because we're very slow, deliberate narratives, one paper relating to the next paper, and trying to build relationship. That's almost domino-like. And I go through pretty much the whole archive and trying to find the right paper for the right place.
Now this gives us an idea about your archive of conversations through the papers. What about other archives? There are the cards, there are the invitation cards. I suppose, I mean, there are all the books you did. You did an amazing, number of artist books, pamphlets. We have, Zach has here a few, copies of and that already are 20 different examples, but I know, I mean, you did many, many more books, so it's your own books, but I'm sure you've got also books by other people, so it's the archive of books. Can you tell us about your many other archives?
I'm very bad at organizing my own archive of my own materials. I have a much better archive of Hans Ulrich's work. This is something I'd like to mention. For the past maybe 12 years, he sends me a package. The package has usually a couple of books, a few articles, several announcements. Been organizing an exhibition about his curatorial practice. Been working on this for many, many years now. The idea of the artist curating the curator, not the other way around. It's a challenging project, very challenging, important because of the mass of material. Right now it's approaching about 1,000 objects. This is just his production, not other books of other people. But in other kinds of archives, actually, there's one I'm working on now that's an archive of trout flights and salmon flights. I know it sounds a little weird, what's fishing have to do with it? But it's connected to an exhibition I'm doing in Dublin at Trinity College, the Glittside Gallery in May. The thing about trout flies and what makes them like a painting is that they're both representations. What does the representation say? Paintings like trout flies can't represent. Well, we use language, so they have to represent. What are they representing? How do they move? So this is a fascinating area for me in the new direction I'm going with, the idea of representations. Just the way the inscriptions on paper become representations of speech rather than writing. Or representations also of conversation, which is very different than the idea of writing again.
Zach, you wrote me a note here about memory.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
So connected to this idea of archives, I wondered if searching for kind of parallel visual form for spoken words affects your own memory, the types of things that you might remember, because you have these now fragments, an archive of fragments of things which otherwise might never have been written down.
Well, that's important you say that, because think about the kind of visual archives people keep, photographs. But we don't keep archives of everyday conversations because speech is evanescent. You speak, and what happens with your words? I like to connect this with the whole idea of the history of ordinariness in art. Look at the still life painting, for example, and how Norman Bryson describes it. In his book on the still life, he talks about the still life in terms of ropography, from the Greek ropos, R-H-O-P-O-S, which means ordinary stuff, stuff that gets trampled afoot. What could be more ordinary than ordinary speech? So the idea of an archive of ordinariness becomes very important. And it also becomes important in one other way, where in the end I'm not trying to focus on the profound nature of language, something histrionic or grand, but rather the sense by which there's a certain meaningful quality in the meaninglessness of everyday life.
That leads us to so many more questions about memory. I don't know, Zach, do we have time for more questions, or shall we start to open it?
We can do both. We can open it
I don't have more questions.
to questions from the floor.
That's a good idea.
Scrap has a microphone. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you.
And we've been actually Googling lots of interviews, because I had like many interviews with Joseph already, but I was wondering if there are any kind of interviews, we didn't know. So we went on the internet yesterday. We found actually 2 interviews with Joseph I had never read before. One is Language as Image. And there is actually something really amazing here about memory, because Zach rose the question of memory, which is Joseph telling about memory of sounds. And in this question of language as image, you were asked if you had memory of sounds. And it was almost like a sound time capsule of June 67. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the sounds of June 67.
Sure, you want me to? Oh. Wow. Maybe we could have Tim explain a little bit about that, because I did one project, a video about memories, and we have here in the audience the person who worked on the audio. Tim, would you stand up? Tim. He did a great job with this because he was dealing with something that was so pathetic. Now here's the thing. The stuff I remember hearing, it's stuff that was reinforced through repetition. So what I remember best are TV commercials, jingles and so on, or music from really dumb TV shows like Gilligan's Island, or commercials like Schlitz beer. So Schlitz is a light beer, a mellow beer, a hearty beer, blended into one beer, a light, bright, fun beer. So that's one beautiful beer. Now, the thing that's really interesting, it's that I still remember this because language is isomorphic. It has iterability. Music too, so you can keep repeating it. The visual image doesn't have that kind of iterability. It does not have isomorphism like language. Really interesting book by a blind writer here in the UK, John Hull, called Touching the Rock, An Experience of Blindness. He talks about his greatest fear. He became blind in his 30s. He had this fear of forgetting what he looks like, because we can't repeat a visual image in our brains because there's no code to represent that image. In language, because we reduce it to code, can repeat it, even though my tone and inflection will be way off. Oliver Sacks, the neurologist, tries to describe a condition called cortical blindness, where the brain actually forgets what it's like to see. You can't imagine images anymore. It's a fascinating subject when memory is concerned, especially over a very long term. I think there's a lot still to be done research in that area. Sachs has a new book out called Musicophilia, where he talks a lot about what they call earworms. When you get a little tune in your brain and you can't get rid of it, these are earworms. And we all got them. But I have to tell you, having something like the theme song from Gilligan's Island playing in your head for 42 years is a lot worse than an earworm.
Got a question?
We have a question in the front.
Thanks. Hans Ulrich, you once said that for you the tyranny of contemporary exhibitions are audio guides, that they, your experience is often of going to an exhibition and never being able to see a painting because there's a flock of people in front of it all listening to the audio guide, and the audio guide somehow introduces a linear direction in perhaps a non-linear experience, which is the exhibition. And I would like to ask Joseph if he feels whether you have a moral attitude or position with respect to captions and texts within exhibitions? Do you feel that an exhibition experience is compromised by this additional didactic text, or do you see there's a possible new opening that these texts provide in the exhibition experience?
Very good question. It depends who's doing the captioning, who's writing the ballet books. In the Contemporary Museum today, which museums I've worked with, Whitney Museum in New York, MCA in Chicago, those ball texts are frequently written by the education department. The artists have no say in them, and we only hear about them, read them often much later on. Now, for example, the 2000 Whitney Biennial was vilified by the press. It was actually a pretty good show, but each work had a lengthy wall text, and the texts were truly embarrassing. The artists didn't see them until they went and opened them, and oh my God, they wanted to run and hide from them. And the press critics had a field day writing about the wall text. Now, to me, I see possibilities for evolving, developing this in an interesting way. Think of Jeanette Curtis's work, how she takes the audio walk in new directions. We have a lot of potential in something like that. I guess it's a question of whether they let the artists start doing this work, or whether the curators themselves start thinking in ways Hans Ulrich did back in the early 90s, seeing its position being one as a catalyst, one which involves creating opportunities and situations. I'm sure artists will respond to it, but a lot of American museums don't want to hand over that authority. Very compartmentalized nature of how discourse flows through the museum. And that really shuts down on a lot. But the potential is there.
But it's interesting because it could almost be the topic one day of a big, a 2 days conference, the question of labels, because in some kind of way it has so much to do with exhibitions. I mean, Cedric Price had this great idea that labels could be stochastic. They could pop up and disappear according to when you're there. I mean, something, Philippe Pareno, Pierre Wieg, Dominique Gonzalez-Förster played with a lot also, this idea of maybe flickering labels or all kinds of ways how one uses the label. And in some kind of way, I mean, it could be some kind of bigger topic, actually. It's super fascinating. But one of the things I thought, Joseph, would be interesting to hear in relation to Schumann's question about the tyranny of this idea of linearity, which is introduced very often by audio guide, and you can't actually return to a painting. You can only follow the one direction. It's not only that, but it's also that it sort of kills conversation. And I mean, one of the things which is very interesting in relation to our experience we had all together with Kerith and Joseph and all the other artists in the Sir John Soanes Museum, when we kind of lived there for a year because we could really use the museum and the guest room, and on Mondays when the museum was closed, we were just, hanging out, and then artists were filming. Isaac Julien did a film. And in our many months in the Soanes Museum, one of the things we observed is that in the Soanes Museum there are many more conversations than in other museums. People do talk to the guards, something you never do in a bigger museum. It sort of you'd rather rarely do it. In the Soanes Museum there's always, you enter the museum and the guard asks you to write your name into a book, and that's the beginning of a conversation. And so, I mean, Joseph, in your work, it's a lot to do with conversation pieces. And Douglas Gordon once said, art maybe is a pretext or an excuse to have a conversation, which I always thought was a really nice definition. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about this notion of conversations, not only in the Soanes Museum, but also the whole idea really of the conversation piece, because, I mean, your piece in the Soanes Museum had a lot to do really with 18th century conversation pieces. And I thought that it could be great to hear more about this.
Well, can I say one thing back about museum guards? I thought that was an interesting comment. There was one very prescient curator who engaged in museum guards, Marcia Tucker. I don't know how many of you know about Marcia, but she worked at the Whitney Museum for a long time, did first Richard title show there and got fired for it. Lots of negative criticism, and said, well, I'm going to go set up my own museum. And she did. She founded the New Museum for Contemporary Art, a museum that's still better than ever in New York. When she founded the New Museum, she felt it important to engage the Kurds. Kurds participated in the Curatorial meetings. They were brought in. The artists came in to talk with them about the work, so they also functioned partly as talking labels, so to speak. Some of her Kurds stayed with the museum for as long as it was down on Broadway. Marcia was very rare for an American curator too. She died 2 years ago, unfortunately, and she is very, very nuts. I'll go back to the ritual conversation piece now. Over the years, I've tried to expand on some of the possibilities of what it can mean or be. I don't have an image to show you, but it's not just about the conversations I have with people, the inscriptions and so on. A couple of years ago, Chicago Tribune newspaper had a photograph. These two guys sitting out on the ice of Lake Michigan. They were sitting on buckets. Guy lifting the little fish through a hole. And they were quoted as saying, oh, people think we're crazy sitting out here on the block of ice, but you know, sitting out here having a conversation, that's what we live for. It's a beautiful basic comment. So what I did as a project related to that, I cast in urethane a couple of buckets, 2 buckets, to try to get at an abstract level at which we engage in conversational exchange. Since the conversation at this level is a dynamic of 2. And so there are a lot of ways for this to grow. I don't think there's any end to the possibilities of how this can keep evolving and growing and changing. That's the beauty of art.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Just got one over here.
Hi. I just wanted to say that I really love the work. It's fantastic. I haven't seen it before, and I'm a little bit jealous because sometimes I feel like I'm in the studio and all we ever do is talk, and I can never produce anything. So I'm quite jealous that you actually managed to make your conversations into finished pieces. It's wonderful. And
it's a tax deduction. No, I think we're just talking about, but I can write off my taxes. It's nuts.
And I was just wondering if you have done any work, or if anyone else has done any work around the conversations. There must be amazing conversations that are had around your pieces in museums, people reading the texts and discussing it with the people that they're with in the exhibition, and just some kind of meta-conversation about your work.
Not that I know of. I do now and then have the experience of a certain kind of meta-conversation occur when people go up and write on the work. That's happened a few times. The owners of the works are not happy about that. Some of the comments can be pretty interesting. Sometimes they're negative. But a couple of times people have said something, oh, this is wonderful, thank you very much, and then signed and dated it. And it was really great dealing with the museum when that happened. They said, how do you know that? They wrote on it was during the show. And I said, well, the date on it was when the show took place. And I go, oh, right. But I don't know of any projects that involve overhearing the overhearing, since in a way that's what you're doing when you're reading the conversations. The difference between the conversation piece we talked about, like with Gainsborough or Thomas Rowlandson or Hogarth, the people are present, but the words are not. inverse operation. In Mayan, the words are present, but the people are not. So it has also that voyeuristic quality of overhearing. What's interesting is how we deal with that. It's a subject in society today. We tell people, don't stare, but we love to overhear. It's one great film on that topic, Gene Hackman's film, The Conversation. I don't know if any of you have seen that film. Awesome film. Thank you.
It's so good that we need to take another question, I think.
Any urgent questions for Joseph?
I'll ask a quick question before we go to the next question. Hans-Ulrich mentioned the possibility of a symposium, a 2-day symposium on wall text, and you mentioned earlier the idea of an exhibition about exhibition devices or exhibition prosthesis. I wondered if you could talk about this idea.
Well, not strictly an exhibition about them. MoMA is organizing an exhibition on Erdit's books that will take, I'm not sure, I think 2011. It's a couple of years on. But no exhibition directly devoted to prosthetics. At CTA in California, they did something related to ephemera, which is, I suppose, something that answers that question. But I really think it's hugely neglected, both from the point of view of where artists engage these conventions for their creative output, and the way they do modulate sometimes, become a little tyrannical in the control of the viewer. And I think that would be a great subject for a small symposium.
Yeah. We have Oliver.
We heard some material about conversations and about storytelling in a perhaps unlinear way. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on your process of editing that found or produced material. So in other words, there's this famous Hitchcock quote saying that life is drama with just the boring bits taken out. So perhaps if you could say how you construct a narrative in that respect.
That's a really good question. You know, I've done a couple of pieces where I put in all the boring stuff and took the interesting stuff out. Precisely to focus on the mundane qualities. People write down something like, okay. You don't have to write down okay, or thank you, or bye. But it depends on the specific work that I'm working on, how I edit it. Sometimes I start with formal intentions. Sometimes I start with narrative intentions. Sometimes I start up in one corner, work towards another. Sometimes I want things to come together at one point. Now, white noise, which Hans-Ulrich talked about, the oval room I did in Paris, about 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, 15 feet high, filled floor to ceiling with papers, all white papers. Now, the narrative in this was very discursive because white noise, the frequency range of white noise, is across the full frequency range. The idea of the oval room came from presenting a narrative that was all middle, no beginning, no end. Many conversations are structured that way. We try to remake a conversation. We're going to remember only fragments of it anyhow. But I do edit some things. I try to keep names out. Normally I ask people, can I have the papers? Anything that could be taken in the very wrong way, I won't put in. I did, however, create one piece from all the papers I can't put in. But I told my wife, you can't let that out until I'm done. But like I said, the narrative's always different, and the kind of editorial judgments I bring to a piece will vary for each one. And some of them are just one piece of paper.
So we have 2 more questions,
Yeah.
I think.
What's going on here? Conversation?
We're having a conversation. So we have 2 more questions. I have a question and Hans-Ulrich has a question.
Unless we have a third,
A third
urgent question from the floor.
Does Brett have a question?
2 is a company, 3 is a crowd. No more urgent questions from the floor. Then we have 2 more questions.
I'll end
Do you
with my
start?
question. I'll end with my question. It's a very short question.
Yes, I wanted to ask Joseph the question I ask him each time we have a conversation. It's actually the question about his unrealized project. And he answers every time differently, so I'm sure we'll have a new, unexpected answer. I mean, the question really about his unbuilt roads, because we've seen tonight many things out of Joseph's practice. We've seen his extraordinary installations. We've seen his printed matters, which are works in their own right, folders and pamphlets and invitation cards and all kinds of other things. But I was wondering how we've talked about his archives, and I was wondering how within all of this are your unbuilt roads, projects which were too big to be realized, projects which were too small to be realized. Projects is interesting because in the architecture world, one talks a lot about unrealized projects, and very often reality gets actually built by publishing unrealized projects over years, and then later things get built. Whilst in the art world, we don't really have the tendency to talk about unrealized projects. We don't know much about artists' unrealized projects. And that's why I kind of stubbornly always ask this question, because I want to know more about unrealized projects. So Joseph, what's in 2009 your favorite unrealized project?
There are 2, big one and little one. Big one. I just described to you white noise, a room-filled floor-to-ceiling, an oval room of conversations on white papers. I want to do one that goes right beside it, black noise, all conversations on colored paper. Both of them parallel to each other. Remember the corner piece I showed with the conversations on white paper and colored paper? Similar concept. Very difficult to build these rooms.
So that's the big one.
Yeah. The little one, it's actually a neon piece that I tried to do for a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago this past winter. It was a very modest piece with the phrase, "Be nice," B-E-N-I-T-E. It's supposed to have 4 lines for each letter. So try to imagine a small b, bigger b, and a bigger b, all contained within each other. Want to put it outdoors at an intersection. That gets a lot of foot traffic, 3 roads coming together. Just put it on the roof of a building. Where it would flash in different ways. B-E-N-I-T-E. Sometimes bigger, very quiet kind of piece. It got turned down by everyone. In Chicago, and these consultants the museum hired to assess the viability of the project said, no, it would fail. It would get lost in the city. If one, 2, maybe 10 of them, and bigger, and put them all over the city, it might succeed. But just one small thing like that, no, it will fail. And I explained, but I want it to be small and subtle and just catch people in an incidental way, not try and stand up there and announce it. It's almost like a whisper. And I think part of the dilemma is that we're caught up a little bit like the 80s was in this moment. The idea of something big and powerful. And I think the changes that are going through global economies now put us in a position of rethinking the possibilities of projects like these. I think what's going to happen is going to be very good outcome. It's a great time to be young and an artist and thinking about possibilities of change, despite all the difficulties that we're all facing and financing projects. Well, like I said, look what happened in the early 90s, the kind of stuff Felix Gonzalez stories was doing with candy, or Tony Fair with egg cartons and marbles and milk bottles.
So I have a last and a final question, a short question that I asked you earlier today. Could you tell me what your favorite conversations are? You mentioned one in particular earlier today.
Yeah, I know where you're going with this question. Like I said, it's kind of incidental stuff I've always found very interesting and engaging. You know, the way some of us sometimes say photographs, maybe when we're with friends, and it's something working quality to it. They're not really something that really great at these photographs. You think, just a photograph of a moment at sights in time, maybe a little accidental. So anyhow, this conversation was with a friend at her studio, and we were about to go into New York. And she said, wait a minute. So I said, okay. She went to do something, then comes back and says, okay, ready to go. I said, well, what happened? What'd you do? She wrote down, I had to set up cat litter. I had to set up cat litter. Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
And I think what better way to end this fantastic lecture and conversation. Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Hans Ulrich.